And later this week, all eyes will be on South Korea for a highly anticipated meeting between Donald Trump and Chinese leader Xi Jinping. It would mark their first face-to-face meeting since President Trump returned to the White House. The US says the two leaders have reached a framework for trade issues with China, which should lead to a trade agreement.
On Air Force One, en route to Japan, US President Donald Trump is confident the bruising trade war between China and the US is drawing to a close.
50% tariff. Nothing has been agreed to yet. Well, we feel good. I mean, we feel good.
On the sidelines of the ASEAN summit in Malaysia, negotiators from the world's top two economies hashed out a framework on Sunday for a deal to pause steeper American tariffs and Chinese rare earths export controls.
I think we've reached a substantial framework for the two leaders who will meet in Korea next Thursday. So, on the table, the president had given me maximum leverage when he threatened 100% tariffs if the Chinese imposed their rare earth global export controls. So I think we have averted that so that the tariffs will be averted.
Scott Bessent also saying Beijing had agreed to make substantial purchases of US agricultural products, especially soybeans. China halted purchases earlier this year in retaliation for US tariffs, wiping out nearly $12.8 billion in US farmers' revenue.
Both sides engaged in constructive discussions on these matters. The stance taken by the United States was firm, while China remained resolute in safeguarding its interests.
Shipping fees and limiting the flow of Chinese fentanyl ingredients to the US were also discussed, but few specific details have been released so far. Trade partners have been anxiously anticipating a breakthrough in the tensions, hoping the two sides can avoid an escalation that could do catastrophic damage to the global economy.
So as you heard, no deal yet, but a framework for a deal. I asked Meredith Crowley, who's a professor of economics at the University of Cambridge, to explain what that means.
Well, I think it means that the most important and critical issues have been sort of pre-negotiated. So there may be a few sticking points, but there's a general broad alignment that concessions will be made by the US in some ways, by China in the other ways. And so when the principals, the two leaders come together, neither will be embarrassed. They can just hash out a few final details, and then they can say that the deal has been struck.
Okay.
So I would imagine at this point, the most important things are done.
Forgive me for interrupting you. We could say that then this framework roughly covers tariffs, rare earth minerals, soybeans, fentanyl and TikTok. So if we set fentanyl and TikTok aside for a moment, those were longer running issues, what does the choice of weapons in this trade war, soybeans and rare earths, tell us about each side's priorities and perceived vulnerabilities?
So one of the interesting things here is, I think from the perspective of the United States and more generally Europe and the high-income West, the vulnerability of only sourcing rare earths from China is a very, very risky thing for now and into the long term. So in the very short term, China's threat to not sell them to the rest of the world was quite a serious threat. But I think what's going to be happening now, China will allow the flow to come back into the United States and other countries. But more deeply, playing in the background is this separate concern of the West that they need to be building out supply chains for these same items to other places. So to some extent, Xi Jinping politically, to his domestic constituency, has stood up to the United States and said, we are very important and you need us. And now Donald Trump has said, okay, I'm going to go meet with you and negotiate with you. You can remove this barrier, and this will give you some more domestic credibility. The Chinese people will think you look like a great leader for standing up to us, and it will look in some ways like we've kind of conceded to some demands of China. So there's a political win here for President Xi. At the same time, this soybean thing, I mean, it's been floating around. President Trump has been raising it since 2019. China agreed in 2019 to buy many more soybeans from the United States. They never did. They never hit any of the quotas and promised purchases. Then they said this, last year they were going to put more restrictions on soybeans. So it's not, in some sense, a very economically substantive agreement they're making. But President Trump can now go back to his constituency and say, the Chinese have now conceded. They are going to buy American soybeans, which is what we always wanted. So in some ways, there's a little bit of political gamesmanship around this whole thing, where they've been fighting this trade war for some time, but we're really back to where we started in the first place, the same kinds of trade in soybeans and rare earths that we would have had all along.
Okay, so given that and the way that we arrived where we are now, has Donald Trump done irreparable damage to the established methods of negotiating trade deals? Because amongst all this turbulence, nobody seems to have been calling for the WTO to intervene, the World Trade Organization.
Yeah, so a very interesting thing is if we go back to the administration of President Obama, he had a number of things he was hoping to negotiate through something that was known as the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was an agreement with countries like including Japan, Australia. But he had a number of priorities for the United States. And if we think about and look at some of those priorities the United States had, and at the time, there was real interest in expanding American sales in things like, digital goods. So think about, companies like Google and Amazon, expanding that across the globe. If you look at what President Trump actually succeeded in achieving in Southeast Asia, in the agreements that were all signed and finalized this week, he's actually made pretty significant progress in that he's induced all of these countries to allow free trade of American goods. So in Europe, there's been a lot of concern and interest in imposing digital services taxes on big American, monopoly-like providers of digital services like Google and Amazon. And Europe hasn't really been able to move forward with this because the Trump administration is so opposed to it.
Right.
Down in Southeast Asia, the president got commitments that
we are going to have to leave it. I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Time has beaten us. And a very detailed explanation, and we thank you for it. Sadly, there isn't time. Perhaps the next time. Professor Meredith Crowley from the University of Cambridge. Thank you so much.
Fraser Howie is an economist and author. I asked him if this is a significant step towards an actual trade deal.
Well, it's obviously a positive step. And again, the fact that tariffs, we're talking about extra 100%, remembering they're already extremely high, obviously needs to be a good thing. But I think expectations need to be kept in check. The China-US relationship is an extremely complicated one. Trump is extremely erratic, and it's a highly imbalanced. If really America, the world's greatest power ever, is arguing soybeans versus rare earth minerals, then that's clearly a ridiculous position to be in. So there's a huge number of issues here that are not going to be solved this weekend. Clearly, ratcheting down of tensions is important, but we are not coming to any grand bargain this weekend at all.
Who would you say is the stronger cards in these negotiations?
Oh, I think it's very difficult to say. I think I wouldn't say both sides have cards. Neither side has a silver bullet. And America does have a lot of power. I think often China a lot of people think China holds the upper cards because of the rare earths sort of stranglehold they have. But remember, China is hugely dependent on trade, hugely dependent on America. And so in that sense, China cannot afford to shoot itself in the foot at all.
So let's talk a little bit more about these rare earths. So obviously China had imposed controls on the export of its rare earths. The framework is now suggesting that they're reconsidering this. Can you tell us more about what they're apparently agreeing to or considering?
Well, apparently that's all we've been told so far, that Bessent's come away believing that the Chinese will probably delay the measures which were to come in within a few weeks. This export license system will maybe delayed a year. I think that, frankly, not just America, but many other countries will be very pleased about that. China does have a strangle, not so much on the actual raw materials, but certainly on the processing and delivery of the materials that are needed. And ultimately, it's not there's not a trade solution to this problem. China will try and use their leverage as long as they have it. The solution is ultimately for America and other countries broadly in the West to start their own mining, their own refining and processing of these materials to simply reduce dependency on China. And that's a multi-year, multi-billion-dollar investment. It's not simply a trade deal type of issue.
Mm-hmm. China is reportedly also now willing to buy soybeans again from the US. Talk to us about how important that is. I mean, is that actually going to help US farmers and in turn help President Trump?
Sure, of course, it's clearly going to help U.S. farmers if you're growing soybeans and no one's buying them. But again, soybeans are a product that can be bought from many countries, and you saw this: Argentina was selling, Brazil selling to the Chinese, and it's a very easy thing to sort of leverage and club to hit Trump with because it affects the farmers directly. But as I say, that's just one aspect in a much more complicated relationship, and frankly, I don't believe the promises of Trump, and I don't believe the promises of the Chinese. So that while we could get through this week, and I said the weekend, I mean just later in the week, we could get through this week without a grand bargain or without any more fireworks. Ultimately, these issues are going to continue to flare up time and time again.
Just a quick question on the future of TikTok. There's apparently been some talk about this and some agreement on what's going to happen with TikTok.
Yes, although when you talk about TikTok, you must realize we're operating in extra-legal territory. From the Supreme Court down, TikTok should be banned in America, but it is not, simply on the whim of the president. And the deal seems to be that Trump wants it sold to his mates. And beyond that, I don't think anyone's got a good idea of what it's going to be. So it's probably part of the mix. But again, since it should be banned at the moment and it's not, frankly, anything's possible.
Fraser Howie, author and economist. Thank you so much for speaking to us, Fraser.
Thank you very much.